its decisions are made. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1204, the Aviation Security Stakeholder Participation Act, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Soliciting input from impacted stakeholders is critical to developing effective policies. H.R. 1204, introduced by the ranking member of the Committee on Homeland Security, Representative Thompson of Mississippi, codifies that sentiment by making permanent the Aviation Security Advisory Committee. Soon after 9/11, industry representatives from all corners of the transportation sector gathered to support TSA's efforts to develop an efficient, effective, and workable security program. For a number of years, this advisory committee was a productive partner to TSA. Unfortunately, TSA allowed the advisory committee to become inactive by letting the charter lapse. Although the Aviation Security Advisory Committee's charter was renewed in 2011, it was only in response to congressional pressure by Ranking Member Thompson in this committee and the repeated complaints about the lack of dialogue between TSA and the industry stakeholders. The Advisory Committee is a valuable asset to our nation's aviation security because it helps ensure that the policies that TSA develops are responsive to security challenges and can be effectively integrated into security operations. Simply put, the Advisory Committee is too valuable to Homeland Security to risk it becoming inactive again. I applaud Ranking Member Thompson for introducing this legislation to make the Aviation Security Advisory Committee permanent, and I thank the Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee for making sure that it moved through the process quickly, and both for seeing the wisdom of making this legislation law. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Louisiana reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield such time as you may consume to the gentleman from North Carolina and Chairman of the Subcommittee on Transportation Security, Mr. Hudson.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Aviation Security Stakeholder Participation Act, introduced by my friend, the Ranking Member of the Homeland Security Committee, Mr. Benny Thompson. This common sense bill ensures stakeholders have a seat at the table when working with their partners at the Transportation Security Administration. Too many times in government, we see a lack of communication between government officials and industry stakeholders. This gap is troubling as it creates a vacuum of ideas and does not allow for a flow of information between the federal government and the private sector that is necessary. Mr. Thompson's bill, which passed out of our committee unanimously, would bridge that gap by allowing the Aviation Security Advisory Committee to take effect and have the constant line of communication to exchange ideas and formulate thoughtful procedures at the agency responsible for securing of our commercial aviation. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Texas reserve?
I do, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as he may consume to the Ranking Member of the Committee on Homeland Security, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.R. 1204, the Aviation Security Stakeholder Participation Act of 2013. Last Congress, I introduced a version of the legislation before us today when the charter of the Aviation Security Advisory Committee was allowed to expire, resulting in the Advisory Committee becoming inactive. Since shortly after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, the Advisory Committee has provided formal stakeholder input and advice to TSA with respect to aviation security policies. I was pleased that in response to my bill, then Secretary Napolitano restored this critical forum for stakeholder input. To prevent a lapse in the Advisory Committee's operation, it is important that it be codified in law. That is exactly what H.R. 1204 does. This bill authorizes in law the establishment of the Aviation Security Advisory Committee to provide representatives from air carriers aircraft manufacturers, airport operators, general aviation stakeholders, and labor organizations, among others, an opportunity to provide input into policy making and have their voices heard. It also requires the establishment of subcommittees to focus on cargo security, general aviation security, perimeter security, exit lane security, security-related technology, and risk-based security, respectively. Whatever your thoughts about TSA's policy decisions, I believe we can all agree that such decisions should be made only after meaningful consultation and coordination with stakeholders. Earlier this year, when TSA announced proposed changes in the prohibited items list, that would have resulted in knives being allowed on planes for the first time since 9/11. We got a first-hand glimpse of the problems that arise when stakeholders are not consulted. Only after an overwhelmingly negative reaction to this decision did Administrator Pistol put the issue before the Advisory Committee for review. Ultimately, after this critical consultation, TSA reversed its decision. So, Mr. Speaker, it's clear that consultation is important. It's clear that codifying this bill is necessary. But I'd also like to add that there are other organizations who want to be placed in the record in support of it. The Cargo Airline Association, the Association of Flight Attendants, the U.S. Travel Association, the Airports Council International, the Security Manufacturers Coalition, General Aviation Manufacturers Association, and the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to once again support legislation to codify the Aviation Security Advisory Committee and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Louisiana reserve?
Yes, I reserve.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further members to speak on this bill, and I will reserve and close once the gentleman from Louisiana closes.
Gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. McCall, and the chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Hudson, and to the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for moving this legislation, and thank you to Mr. Thompson for introducing it. And I would once again urge my colleagues to support this legislation to codify the Aviation Security Advisory Committee so that stakeholders have a permanent seat at the table when TSA develops policies that have a direct impact on our security and their operations. Simply what it does is guarantees that policies won't be implemented solely by people relying on theory, but ensures that the stakeholders are at the table to talk about the reality of the policies that they implement. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would again urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I would yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Louisiana yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge adoption of this bipartisan bill. I want to thank Chairman Hudson, ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Thompson, ranking member Richmond, and I'm proud to report to this House that this committee has passed several bills, all of which have passed unanimously out of our committee. And I'm not sure if there's any committee in Congress that can say that. And I'm very proud of that effort. And I hope that we can continue in that spirit with more complex legislation that we face in the future. But I know that with the ranking member and his spirit of cooperation, we'll be able to get it done. And so with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1204 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Mr. Speaker?
Gentleman from Texas.
I request the yeas and the nays.
The gentleman from Texas has requested the yeas and nays. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 3626 to extend the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 for 10 years.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3626, a bill to extend the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 for 10 years.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott. The House will be in order. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, and the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Scott, will each control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of H.R. 3626, a bill to extend the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 for 10 years. In 1988, Congress passed the original law that makes it illegal to manufacture, import, sell, ship, deliver, possess, transfer, or receive any firearm that is not as detectable by walk-through metal detection or any firearm with major components that do not generate an accurate image before standard airport imaging technology. The original act passed in 1988, Mr. Speaker, and had a 10-year sunset which expired November 10, 1998. Congress renewed the bill for 5 years in 1998 and for 10 years in 2003. The law will sunset on December 9, 2013 if it is not reauthorized again. The original law received overwhelming bipartisan support, and so did each subsequent renewal. I urge my colleagues to support. Strike that. I yield my colleagues to support the overwhelming, to verify the overwhelming bipartisan support and the extension. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 3626, which will extend by 10 years the authorization of the Undetectable Firearms Act, the statute which is in effect through December 9th of this year. The Undetectable Firearms Act prohibits the importation, manufacture, sale, transport, or possession of firearms that are undetectable by metal detectors or X-ray machines. Signed into law by President Reagan in 1988, the statute remains critical to public safety. The law helps protect us from firearms that are undetectable by some of the most conventional means of firearms detection. The law prevents the commercial production and proliferation of such weapons that could be used either by individuals or organized terrorist groups seeking to commit crimes in secure areas such as courthouses or airplanes. Unfortunately, the need for such protection has grown in recent years. The statute was originally authorized for 10 years, subsequently reauthorized for periods of 5 and then another 10 years. The authorization of this prohibition has been incremental because Congress recognized that the technology would evolve and that we may need to update the statute to maintain its effectiveness. In fact, this is what has transpired. The current law has a critical loophole that may enable and encourage the production of firearms that may escape detection. Under the statute, someone may produce a plastic firearm which is detectable only because it has a metal component, which is not essential to the operation of the firearm, but is easily removable by the firearm user seeking to avoid detection. In fact, some designs made available on the Internet to assist the manufacture of such guns using 3D printers include such a feature. We need to strengthen the law to address this obvious problem, and we should adopt the Undetectable Firearms Act modernization proposal sponsored by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Israel. He is proposing that the statute be updated to require that the metal which makes a firearm detectable be included in the essential components of the firearm, so if removed, the gun would not operate. This is a simple and effective means of addressing the problem. And while I support the reauthorization of the Undetectable Firearms Act for 10 years, a 10-year extension should not be interpreted as an agreement that the statute should remain unchanged for that entire term. We need to work quickly to update the law, but it does not appear that we'll be able to do that in the time left before the statute's expiration. However, we cannot allow the law to expire for the existing, even if imperfect, protections to lapse. Finally, with the continued toll of gun violence in our communities, Congress must act immediately on other measures to strengthen our gun laws. We're nearing the first anniversary of the killing of 20 students and 6 teachers at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. While such tragic mass shootings bring increased attention to the problem of gun violence, we must recognize that the scope of the problem is much greater. An average of over 30 people a day are murdered with firearms in America. However, during this Congress, the House has taken no steps to address the problem. The Judiciary Committee has held no hearings and has not even considered any of the other measures which have been proposed to make us safer from gun violence. For example, we must make a priority of extending the Brady Act to keep firearms out of the hands of criminals, and we should take action on H.R. 1565, the Public Safety and Second Amendment Rights Protection Act, which would expand the Brady background check requirement to firearms sold at gun shows and through commercial advertisements. We should also consider bills such as H.R. 1318, the Youth Promise Act, which is designed to promote proven crime prevention strategies. With respect to the bill before us today, I commend the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Coble, for introducing the measure to extend the term of the current statute. The Undetectable Firearms Act continues to help protect public safety, and we should reauthorize it while also working to update and improve it without delay. I therefore urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3626, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further requests for speakers.
The gentleman from North Carolina continues to reserve. The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia who serves ably as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Crime. I also want to thank my friend, the gentleman from North Carolina, who truly is a gentleman and who will be missed for his bipartisan work on this bill. We have worked well together, and I'm deeply grateful to the gentleman for that partnership. Mr. Speaker, in 1988, when we passed the Undetectable Firearms Act, the notion of a 3D printed plastic firearm slipped through metal detectors onto our planes in secure environments was a matter of science fiction. The problem is that today it is a reality, and in only 6 days the law banning Undetectable Firearms Act expires, and so we have to act now. Now, this law was enacted under President Reagan in 1988. It was reauthorized under President Clinton. It was reauthorized again in 2003 under President Bush. When Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and George Bush agree on something, so should we. This has always been a matter of bipartisanship, and so we should continue that bipartisanship and pass this bill today. It's bipartisan because it is a matter of common sense that we don't want to make it easy for terrorists and criminals to bring guns past metal detectors onto our planes and into secure environments. Now, as the gentleman from Virginia stated, in our view, this bill is not perfect. I would have preferred to modernize the Undetectable Firearms Act to eliminate some loopholes in the law by requiring that certain metal components be permanent or not easily removed. I would have liked to close that loophole, but frankly I believe that even a loophole in a law is better than no loophole at all. A loophole can be closed down the line. That is a preferred scenario to no law at all. And so I'm not going to oppose this first step because we can't get all of our steps. We will step forward and continue to support the modernization of the Undetectable Firearms Act. This, for now, is a very good step. It's a step that all of our colleagues should support. I again thank the gentleman from North Carolina for his bipartisan leadership. I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and I yield back to the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia, reserve.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that the statement from the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary, Mr. Conyers, be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman from New York for his comments and for his legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman from New York for his generous words. I appreciate that, Mr. Israel. And I too yield back. But I first ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks. and include extraneous material on H.R. 3626 currently under consideration.
Without objection. Does the gentleman yield back the balance of his time?
I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 3626? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 255.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 147, H.R. 255, a bill to amend certain definitions contained in the Provo River Project Transfer Act for purposes of clarifying certain property descriptions and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I'll yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 255, sponsored by Congressman Chaffetz of Utah, allows the Provo River Water Users Association to own a canal facility that it has operated and maintained and repaid for decades. This title transfer was the original intent of the public law enacted in 2004, and the passage of this bill would remove existing legal barriers in order to fulfill that intent. A companion measure by Senator Hatch passed the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee in May. The whole matter comes down to this. The canal was originally an open earthen canal in a rural setting. The city of Provo grew up around it until, for a variety of reasons, it was decided to enclose the canal, essentially changing it to a pipeline. In order to make it possible for the local water authority to raise non-federal capital to do so, Congress adopted the Provo River Transfer Act in 2004 to authorize the Bureau of Reclamation to convey title to the association for the canal as it existed when the act was adopted. Now that the enclosure is completed and the time has come to transfer title, as Congress directed nearly a decade ago, the Bureau of Reclamation has opined that by covering the canal, it's technically no longer a canal but rather a pipe facility, that it's now different than the facility in existence when Congress ordered the transfer of title, and therefore it doesn't meet the specifications of the Conveyance Act. And so in an only in Washington, D.C. moment, we now have this measure before us that changes the facility description in the 2004 Act to the, quote, water conveyance facility historically known as the Provo Reservoir Canal, unquote, so that the title transfer can proceed. The passage of this bill would amend outdated legal definitions while accelerating repayments to the U.S. Treasury. The legislation continues a positive trend demonstrated by the Natural Resources Committee of economically empowering our communities. The Bureau of Reclamation supports the bill. I'm unaware of any opposition. I'd urge its adoption and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, H.R. 255 is a technical correction for the Provo River Transfer Act. This change will allow for the title transfer of the Provo River Canal to the Provo River Water Users Association. The administration supports the legislation, and we do not oppose the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield such time as he may consume to the author of the measure, the distinguished member from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you. I simply want to thank both sides of the aisle. I want to thank Mr. McClintock, the chairman of this subcommittee, for allowing us to move this forward. I appreciate Mr. Grijalva, the ranking member, to the committee for allowing this to pass. This is truly a technical change. It strikes the term canal and replaces it with water conveyancy facility historically known as the Provo Reservoir Canal. The final payment to the federal government of $700,000 will be completed once this bill becomes law. It scores positively. It is truly a technical change. I appreciate the indulgence of the Congress on both sides of the aisle to making this happen, and I urge its adoption. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from California continue to reserve?
Reserve.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve, Mr. Speaker.
I wonder if the gentleman has any more speakers on this?
No.
Then, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry?
They're not here.
Do you wish to close?
Yes.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield back the remainder of our time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
And, Mr. Speaker, I'd urge his adoption of the measure, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 255? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to the gentleman from California is recognized.
On that, I'd request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor taking this vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on the motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2388 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 142, H.R. 2388, a bill to authorize the Secretary of the Interior to take certain federal lands located in Dorado County, California, into trust for the benefit of the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
And I'll yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians occupies a federal reservation in the Sierra foothills in El Dorado County in California. They lost much of their land when Highway 50 was constructed through the reservation several decades ago. They were left with enough land to eventually build a successful casino, but had very little additional space for tribal housing. Now, adjacent to their reservation is a 40-acre abandoned and landlocked property. I say abandoned because it was never developed, and it's presently dangerously overgrown with scrub brush that's just waiting to become a wildfire, which could rapidly spread either to the existing reservation or to an adjacent residential neighborhood. As it turns out, this abandoned parcel is owned by the Bureau of Land Management. The Bureau of Land Management didn't even know that it owned the property when the Miwok first approached it about this matter. In fact, I'm told the BLM actually had to be convinced that it does indeed own the land that it has obviously never managed. The Miwok would like to acquire this parcel for the reservation, making up some of the land they lost due to the construction of Highway 50. It would be used for tribal housing, and the bill specifically forbids its use for gambling, a condition that the Shingle Springs Band has agreed to. The parcel is untended, overgrown, and unused, and this land transfer would put it to productive use for reservation housing, a use fully compatible with adjacent land usages. Indeed, by doing so, the tribe will be removing a major fire risk for both the reservation and the nearby community. Access would be through the existing reservation to avoid any impact on the existing neighborhood, and the tribe is committed to working with the nearby homeowners association to assure that it doesn't affect the rural nature of the community. The property is on unincorporated county land, and the County Board of Supervisors, which is the land use planning agency with jurisdiction over this land, fully supports the transfer. The administration supports my bill, and I'd urge adoption of the legislation, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. The Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians is a federally recognized Indian tribe with a reservation located 40 miles east of Sacramento. The band is currently in need of housing to accommodate its growing membership and identified approximately 41 acres of land currently managed by the Bureau of Land Management for placement into trust. The ban anticipates designing a residential community with community buildings and recreational facilities within that community, and will also consider non-gaming economic development as well. H.R. 2388 would authorize the Secretary of Interior to take the land into trust and would explicitly prohibit Class 2 and Class 3 gaming activities on these lands once they're placed into trust. The County of El Dorado supports the ban's efforts to secure the BLM property in trust and has entered into a memorandum of understanding with the tribe. We support H.R. 2388 and these efforts, and we reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves.
You need time? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Let me thank the gentleman for yielding, and let me rise to indicate my recognition of the importance of this legislation and to support it. And to make the point simply on this bill dealing with the Secretary of the Interior is to study the issue of large parks, urban parks, in our respective urban areas as being in the jurisdiction of the Secretary of the Interior Department, because we are losing that parkland because of the inability to collaborate with the federal government on the resources that are so necessary. I recognize that we're in sequestration, but I believe that it is important that we collaborate, and I wanted to make sure that I put that on the record. Let me also put on the record, as a member of the Homeland Security Committee, and ask unanimous consent to introduce these into the record, my support for the TSA Loose Change Act, H.R. 1095, my support for H.R. 2719, the Transportation Security Acquisition Reform Act, and my special support for H.R. 1204, the Aviation Security Stakeholder Participation Act of 2013, because in fact that stakeholder committee is going to help provide more security for our TSO officers and have stakeholders dealing with issues like phones on airplanes, guns on, knives on airplanes. Certainly guns are only held by the pilots in the pilot program, but it's going to be able to allow stakeholders to be able to have a real say in aviation security, and I think that is crucially important. Let me also acknowledge my support for the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988 and its extension, and I would hope that that bipartisan support, along with Mr. Cobble, who we have such great respect for, that bipartisan support will lead us to universal background checks and the passage of federal legislation that would require all of us to store our guns. It's nothing difficult to provide or buy a simple safe to store your guns and to protect those from undue harm. So I thank my colleague for yielding to me. My understanding is that we are here on the floor of the House to do work. Some people find it humorous when members rise to the floor and add additional commentary dealing with their constituency and their work. And since I believe in working, and I believe in working on behalf of my constituents, I'm very grateful to the gentleman from Arizona recognizing the seriousness of which I make these points and allowing me to have this time on this legislation. I think all of us can recognize that when the floor is open, it is open for members to come and make serious commentary about the work that they would hope this Congress would be able to do. I guess I close by simply saying I want to thank the gentleman. He has many capacities, co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, but I want to thank him for his leadership on immigration reform. And for those of us who were down with the Families for Fast, I again say that we pray for them. We pray that the hearts on this Congress will be touched, that we will be able to as well finish and complete comprehensive immigration reform, something my constituency is also now praying for on the steps of City Hall. I yield back to the gentleman. Thank you very much.
The gentlelady from Texas yields back. Without objection, your requested placements in the record will be granted. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we yield back the remainder of our time.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for their support of this legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2388 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. And without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, the title is amended. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1963 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1963, a bill to amend the Water Conservation and Utilization Act to authorize the development of non-federal hydropower and issuance of leases of power privileges at projects constructed pursuant to the authority of the Water Conservation and Utilization Act and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
So ordered.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1963 by Congressman Daines of Montana seeks to jumpstart conduit hydropower development at 11 Bureau of Reclamation projects. The bill specifically removes statutory impediments by authorizing non-federal hydropower development at these conduits and provides administrative and regulatory reforms necessary to foster such development. Earlier this year, the House passed H.R. 678 by Congressman Tipton and Costa by a 416-7 vote to promote conduit hydropower development at reclamation facilities. H.R. 678 applied to hundreds of reclamation facilities that are covered under the authorities of the Reclamation Project Act of 1939. This measure applies to the remaining reclamation facilities, all of which are governed under the different and more complex authorities of the Water Conservation and Utilization Act of 1939. The Tipton bill provided for a streamlined regulatory process, in part by providing a categorical exemption for redundant environmental reviews. The WCUA actually forbids the installation of small hydroelectric generators in the projects regulated under this Act, and thus the need for this separate legislation. The arguments in favor of getting the federal government out of the way so that private contractors can lease existing federal pipelines and canals for the purpose of installing small hydroelectric generators are well known to the House, as evidenced by the overwhelming bipartisan vote accorded to the Tipton bill earlier this year. That bill was signed into law a few months ago, and I'm told it's already produced a flood of new applications for clean and cheap small hydroelectric generators. Not only has a new source of absolutely clean and inexpensive hydroelectricity been made available, the federal treasury benefits from the revenues that these leases produce, in addition to the added economic activity that they enable. Mr. Daines' measure completes that work by applying the same policy to the remaining reclamation facilities that fell under the WCUA. I commend the gentleman from Montana for his leadership on this issue and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. We concur with Mr. McClintock's description of the legislation, and we have no objections to H.R. 1963.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield such time as he may consume to the author of this measure, the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Daines.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my bill, H.R. 1963, the Bureau of Reclamation Conduit Hydropower Development Equity and Jobs Act. In Congress, one of our top priorities is to secure American energy independence. And as we all see in this institution, we don't always agree on how best to meet that goal. However, hydropower is a clean, renewable source of energy, and finding innovative ways to develop this resource is an area where most of us can agree. And I'm grateful that Chairman McClintock and Ranking Member Grijalva support this bill, and we're pleased to see the bipartisan spirit behind this piece of legislation. Bureau of Reclamation projects such as canals, pipelines, and dams play an important role in supplying water for our communities. Agriculture is the primary economic driver in my home state of Montana, and having a sound and strong irrigation system is critically important to us back home. H.R. 1963 will amend the Water Conservation and Utilization Act to allow for Conduit hydropower development on 11 Bureau of Reclamation projects governed under this act. That includes some in my home state of Montana, including the Buffalo Rapids near Miles City, the Intake Project by Glendive, the Milk River Project, as well as the Missoula Valley Project. With this legislation, our irrigation systems can also power our homes and our businesses. Additionally, this bill will help provide revenues to improve critical infrastructure for farmers and ranchers who rely on these systems. In Montana, balancing energy development with responsible stewardship of our resources is the way we do business in Montana. Our livelihoods, our access to recreation, and the future of our state for our kids rely on a robust, balanced energy plan that also protects our unique landscapes, and that's what keeps us Montanans loving the place that we call home. A diverse energy portfolio helps keep electric prices low for Montana families and creates jobs. Hydropower is an important part of that puzzle, and my bill will help us get there. H.R. 1963 has received strong bipartisan support in committee, and I urge the same here today.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from California continue to reserve?
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Speaker, thank you, and yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I again commend the gentleman from Montana for his work on this issue. It is one of the most important achievements in power development that we've had recently, the jump-starting of these small hydro power generators. I thank the gentleman from the other side of the aisle for his support of the measure and urge its adoption. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1963 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1241.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar number 202, H.R. 1241, a bill to facilitate a land exchange involving certain National Forest System lands in the Inyo National Forest and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1241 authorizes the Forest Service to acquire 2 parcels of land outside the boundary of the Inyo National Forest in exchange for a parcel of National Forest land conveyed to the Mammoth Mountain ski area. The ski area has been operating its main base under a special use permit. However, acquiring ownership of that parcel under this legislation would allow the ski area to conduct desperately needed renovations to its facilities. At the same time, the Forest Service would be able to acquire land that it currently leases to operate facilities outside the boundary of the Inyo National Forest. I'd urge adoption of this sensible measure authored by Congressman Paul Cook and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. H.R. 1241 would authorize the Secretary of Agriculture to accept lands outside the boundaries of the Inyo National Forest in the Eastern Sierra in exchange for non-federal lands desirable for the National Forest System purposes. If completed, the land exchange would result in significant revenue for the federal government. The bill has bipartisan support, including the Department of Agriculture, and I urge its passage in the House, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm now pleased to yield such time as he may consume to my colleague from California, Congressman Paul Cook, the author of this bill.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. H.R. 1241 obviously would facilitate a land exchange in Mono County, California. It would allow the Mammoth Mountain ski area to obtain 21 acres surrounding the Mammoth Mountain Inn that it currently leases from the National Forest Service. In return, Mammoth Mountain would transfer 1,500 acres of land with a cash equalization payment to the National Forest Service. This would allow the Mammoth Mountain to replace and rebuild the Mammoth Mountain Inn. After more than 50 years of use, the inn suffers from poor, deteriorated construction, and its replacement would allow Mammoth Mountain to continue operating California's premier ski area. This bill is a jobs bill. Mammoth Mountain's employment fluctuates between a high of 2,500 employees during the winter to down to 650 in the summer. Mono County has a population of only 14,000 people. Thus, this area is by far and above the largest employer in the country. This would help facilitate and would create new construction jobs. But it would also allow the ski area to expand, creating more permanent jobs. And it's also an environmental bill. The 1,500 acres that Mammoth Mountain would be transferring to the Forest Service has long been desired for protection by local environmentalists and the Forest Service. It will end what the Inyo National Forest supervisor described as a very, very imminent threat to the scenic basin. The legislation is supported by the Mono County Board of Supervisors, Town Council, various chambers of commerce, and the Eastern Sierra Land Trust. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this vital local bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman from California yields back. Does the gentleman from California continue to reserve?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
We yield back the balance of our time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, again, I thank the gentleman for his support of the measure and urge its adoption. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1241? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1846 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 203, H.R. 1846, a bill to amend the act establishing the Lower East Side Tenement National Historic Site and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
And I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1846 expands the boundaries of the Lower East Side Tenement Historic Site to include an additional building purchased in 2007. This Manhattan Museum is a National Park Service affiliated site, and therefore it carries no cost to the taxpayers because it's owned and operated by a private foundation. I'd urge its adoption and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Tenement Museum was founded in 1988. And has preserved the history of immigration in Manhattan's Lower East Side for the last 25 years. Through the personal experiences of the generations of migrants that have called 91 Orchard Street home, over 200,000 annual visitors are able to hear the stories of real families that lived in the building between 1863 and 1935. H.R. 1846 would expand the boundaries of the current National Park Service affiliated site at 91 Orchard Street to include two buildings, recently purchased building 2 doors away, and will allow the Tenement Museum to expand the stories they tell. This new building holds an array of untold stories from a family of Holocaust survivors who were allowed in the United States under the first Refugee Act, and Puerto Rican and Chinese families that were part of the foundation of making New York home to the largest Puerto Rican community on the American mainland and the largest Chinatown in the Western Hemisphere. The ranking member of the Small Business Committee Representative Velasquez is to be commended for her legislation on behalf of this important cultural and historic resource. We support H.R. 1846, urge its passage by the House today, and reserve the balance of our time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as she may consume to the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, the sponsor of this legislation, the gentlelady from New York, Representative Velasquez.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member, and especially the ranking member, for yielding. I rise in support of this critical legislation and urge my colleagues to support its passage. Throughout our nation, in every city and town, immigrants have been critical to strengthening our communities. For centuries, people from every corner of the globe have traveled to the United States to start a new life, work hard, build a future for their children, and pursue their share of the American dream. In New York especially, immigrants have long been an important part of the cultural fabric. Whether it is Chinatown, Little Italy, or our burgeoning Latino population, immigrants have made our city stronger, more vibrant place, offering invaluable economic and cultural contributions while shaping the city's identity. There are numerous ways we pay tribute to immigrants' role in American society. The Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island honor the thousands who arrived in New York's ports seeking a greater opportunity and freedom. This past week, we celebrated Thanksgiving, a holiday that originated with some of our earliest immigrants. In short, symbols of immigration's importance are woven throughout our society, in physical landmarks, holidays, even our families' histories. In my district, the Lower East Side Tenement Museum reminds New York residents and visitors alike of the challenges faced by some of our city's earliest immigrants. For 25 years, this valuable local institution has offered interactive exhibits recounting the story of the 7,000 working-class families who inhabited these buildings. Just as the Lower East Side tenement communities evolved with each successive wave of newly arrived immigrants, the museum tells a wide range of stories reflecting the diversity of this storied neighborhood. Whether it was Asian, Irish, or German immigrants, or Eastern European Jews, the Lower East Side's tenement housed generation after generation of new arrivals to our cities and our country. This body has previously recognized the museum as significant to our nation's history. In 1998, I worked with my colleagues to pass legislation designating 97 Orchard Street as an affiliated site of the National Park System. Over the years, interest in the museum has grown steadily. Today, the museum serves 200,000 visitors every year, including 40,000 school children. This growth in popularity has resulted in demand for additional space. The bill I authored and that we are debating today will help address this need by making the museum's valuable educational tools available to a wider audience. The bill further honors immigrants' role in our nation's past, present, and future. The additional space will also allow the museum to explore more immigrant stories, including the history of Holocaust survivors, rebuilding their lives in America. Mr. Speaker, the immigrant story is the American story. The Tenement Museum honors the men, women, and children who came here to carve out a better life and in the process improve our country through an infusion of new cultures and ideas. H.R. 1846 will ensure the Lower East Side Tenement Museum continues telling this uniquely American story to future generations. I urge my colleagues to support its passage. I thank both gentlemen, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does the gentleman from Arizona continue to reserve?
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as she may consume to the gentlelady from New York, ranking member of the Joint Economic Committee, Representative Maloney.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on this legislation and so many other important areas before our country. I rise in strong support of this bill, H.R. 1846, the Lower East Side Tenement National Historic Site Amendments Act, which was authored and introduced by my good friend and colleague Nydia Velasquez from New York. This legislation will expand the boundaries of the Lower East Side Tenement National Historic Site to include 103 Orchard Street, which is located just two doors down from the original museum location. And it will expand it, because of this, will be able to expand its educational programs and allow more people to learn about our nation's immigrant history. I had the privilege of representing the Tenement Museum in Congress prior to this year when new congressional boundaries were implemented, and I still serve as an honorary trustee of this important institution. And I can say without hesitation that the Lower East Side Tenement Museum is one of our nation's most important historic and cultural institutions. In recognition of the important work that they do, the National Endowment of the Humanities just recently awarded them a $500,000 matching grant. Founded 25 years ago, the museum brings to life the experiences of those immigrant families who settled in one of our nation's most iconic and important neighborhoods, the Lower East Side. Through these stories, the museum tells the story of our great country, a nation of immigrants, and how our national identity is constantly evolving and changing thanks to immigration. Over 200,000 people visit the museum each year to learn about these stories, and that's not by accident. The Tenement Museum has found a unique way to personalize and bring to life history through the stories of individual families who actually lived in these buildings. And they take rooms and they make one for the Irish, one for the Greek, one for the Jews. They have all these stories, and you learn not only the history but the stories of the particular families who lived there. The original museum building at 97 Orchard Street tells the progression of our country through the stories of immigrant families from Italy, Ireland, Poland, Greece, Austria, Russia, Germany, and Lithuania through 1935. The bill before us will allow the museum to expand to a new site so it can tell the stories of Jewish Holocaust survivors post-1965, Chinese families, and Puerto Rican families in the 1950s, bringing the immigrant history to the present day. I commend the Natural Resources Committee for reporting out this legislation and the House leadership for bringing it to the floor, and my colleague and friend Nydia for authoring it, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1846, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Arizona reserve.
Yield back the balance of our time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd urge adoption of the legislation and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 1846 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the Chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2650 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2650, a bill to allow the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa in the state of Minnesota to lease or transfer certain land.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, and the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, this legislation would ensure that the Non-Intercourse Act, which limits legal transactions by tribes, does not interfere with the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa tribes' ability to lease, buy, or sell fee land owned by the tribe. The bill also clearly states that it does not authorize the tribe to sell, transfer, lease, convey, or warrant all or any portion of land held in trust by the federal government. There is precedent for tribes to seek legislation in Congress to waive the Non-Intercourse Act for transactions of non-trust land because of an overabundance of caution by both tribal and non-tribal parties. I'd ask for adoption of the bill and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. The Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa and the County of Carleton, Minnesota, have proposed a land exchange involving 1,400